With the help of some brothers and sisters, this podcast was created to discuss some spiritual topics that you may have questions about. The goal is that you gain a better understanding on the topic, but more importantly, that you grow closer to the Lord. With the help of my little buddy, kick us off.
Stop being pew potato. But Josh Hudson.
Welcome to Stop Being a Pew Potato. I'm Josh Hudson, and today I'm with two evangelists who are working in San Francisco, Joshua Carter and Josh Lewis. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
There's three Joshes, and for the sake of confusion, I think that we should be ranked. So I'll be Josh number one. Which one of you guys want to be number two and number three?
I'm older. I claim two.
Yeah, you look more like a number two.
All right. So every day we're forced to make decisions, and some days we have to make difficult ones. Difficult decisions can really weigh on us. They can make us lose sleep and cause a lot of stress. And with y'all's help today, we're going to talk about how to make difficult decisions. There's so many people in the Bible we can look to who've made difficult decisions. Abraham and the offering of Isaac. Joseph, how he dealt with his brothers. Jonathan, how his dad and his best friend were at odds, and yet he never compromised their relationships. And even Peter, he had difficult decisions to make, and yet he stood his ground. Although the level of our decisions we're faced with may be different, we still have to make difficult decisions in our life. Our approach determines what we choose. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
A lot of the times when we're making decisions that seem really difficult, I think it's because we're trying to decide like what is the right thing to do. And that can cause us a lot of anxiety because maybe we're trying to figure out, is there a path that is right? And is there a path that's wrong? Or is there a path that's better than a different path? And those, to me, are the decisions that are the hardest ones to make that, like you were talking about, cause us to lose sleep or stress or keep us up at night. But in a lot of the cases that you mentioned, those decisions were not hard for those people because they were trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. It was hard because they knew the right thing to do, and it would just cause some discomfort or some stress. And so I think like the first part of it is that if it's something that God has actually given instruction on, I mean, it's really pretty simple. It can be hard, but it's simple. When God says to do something, when God says, go to a land that I will show you, to somebody like Abraham, he knew what to do. And so he did it. And so I think that's the first thing, is that like, if it's something that's clear, then that kind of takes the decision making out of it. Doesn't make it easy all the time, but at least it makes it simple.
One thing that I thought about as you're kind of discussing that and making that point is it's important to kind of begin to think outside of ourselves, which is really easy to do because I live in my own head, 24/7. The way that I experience things, the things that I see are all from my vantage point. And so it can be really tricky sometimes to begin to even ask the question, how am I perceiving things? But we have to understand that the way we make decisions doesn't always hinge on our personal experience or our own vantage point on them. Sometimes there are things that affect a decision that are outside of my niche or my experience. And so I think just even beginning there, just to say that I may not always have the final word on the way that I should approach this or all the information or even the right to even say one way or another about something that I'm undertaking or deciding on is a good beginning step.
Guys, when we're faced with a difficult decision, what can we do to make sure that we're approaching this choice with the right perspective?
Yeah, so I think that there's like a flow that we should be going through and questions that we should be asking ourselves. And it's like I was saying a minute ago, is that if it's something that God has actually directly spoken on, well, then there's really not a decision to make, or there's not really like a choice between different options that we have to figure out what's right. We know what's right. It's just a matter of doing it. But then there's a lot of things in life that we're having to decide about that there's not like a book, chapter, and verse for, right? So it's like, where should I live? And who should I marry? And what school should I go to? And what career should I explore and whatever. And so then there's got to be other principles that guide us, because there's not like a verse that might just answer that question for us. And to me, it's comforting that even the writers of the New Testament sometimes would talk about God's will being unclear to them on some of those things. Like Paul would talk about his travel plans that sort of way. And then James would even talk about like the way that we think about going to a city and buying and selling and making a profit, saying like, if it's God's will, we'll do that, but we just don't really know how that's going to play out. And so that's when I think we have to start asking questions like, if God hasn't spoken on this issue directly about what's right or wrong for me to do, well, then has God spoken on this issue in principle? And we have to think about like, what are the things that are important to God, and how would that be reflected in the choices that I might make? And that, I think, will at least put us on the right track on the things that are a little less objectively certain, about what God's will is.
Yeah, I agree with Josh completely. And to begin establishing a helpful or correct perspective to even begin to understand how to make any given decision, you do have to end up kind of in the place that Josh was just talking about, where we're figuring out, we're consulting, like, what is God's will in this? I mean, Jesus would even talk like that. If anybody ever had the right, or maybe even the expectation that they could just make decisions for themselves, it should have been Jesus. And yet he says, that he came down from heaven not to do his own will, but the will of him who sent me. And so, to begin to find the right perspective is to begin to ask the question that Josh was talking about, like, what is God's will? And the answer to that is maybe not as always clear as we want it to be. Sometimes it's crystal clear. But we also understand that Scripture tells us that there's a way that might seem right to me as a man, but the end of that way is death. And so the right framework for any question that I approach needs to be looking at it from a lens that God gives us and not our own. I guess I should say it that way.
So like if I have this question about, okay, what's the right decision for me to make in this circumstance? I think a lot of times that question is answered by asking the question, has God spoken on this directly? And then a lot of times that isn't answered by that. And so the next question has to be, well, has God spoken on this in principle? And one encouraging principle that the scriptures give me on that front is that this is something that God is causing us to be more mature as we grow to know him better, that we come to have a better ability to discern what's right and what's wrong and what's wise and what's unwise. And we can distinguish better and better about those paths. And so, if God hasn't given us some answer that is just like, you take this path, then we don't need to be looking into the Bible as like a crystal ball where we're trying to like figure out some hidden answer. But we look at it as like a sculptor that is shaping our hearts and changing our minds and causing us to learn to love the things that God loves and to let that be what controls us.
I think a lot of us have made decisions based off of what is pragmatic, practical, or safe. Is this a pattern we can see from Jesus, his apostles, or even the early church?
In a word, I'll say no. I mean, it's tempting, and that, if I'm honest with myself, that's the way that I think for the most part on a day-to-day basis. But I mean, in Luke chapter 10, when Jesus sent his disciples out, he told them, go your way. Behold, I'm sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. And so, we talk about Jesus being a good shepherd, but he sort of seems like a reckless shepherd when you think about it that way. Like a shepherd, you would think, should keep his lambs in the safest place. But there he was saying, I'm sending you out, and I'm sending you out somewhere dangerous. And I think that that's reflected in a lot of different ways. But I mean, it seems clear to me just from that statement that no, the thing that is guiding these decisions is not just purely our personal comfort or safety even.
And to go back to our kind of where we started in this conversation, what can we do to make sure that we're approaching any like choice or decision from the right perspective. Well, in asking this question about pragmatic, practical, and safe decision making, it reveals whether or not we're on the right track with our perspective, because the answer biblically is our decision making is not necessarily just what's pragmatic, practical, or safe.
Right.
And that, if we can say that, if we can understand that, then that begins to reveal that we're looking at things with a godly perspective. But at the same time, in God's eyes, any decision that we make that's according to his will in like the fullest sense is practical and safe. He's assured us of the outcome of that kind of decision making, that life. But, when you look at it with the world's eyes, the wrong perspective, things that the early church did would make no sense as far as being pragmatic. I mean, in Acts chapter 2, when they're selling all their stuff and just giving it away to the people that had need, that seems like the opposite of pragmatic. I don't think Dave Ramsey has ever told anybody to live their life that way. As far as being safe, I mean, Jesus talked about how the world was going to hate them because it hated him who was before them. And if the world didn't, it would mean that they were of the world, but they aren't of the world, so it was going to hate them. And so Jesus has no expectation that our life is going to be pragmatic in the world's eyes. And he even sets it up to be unsafe in certain instances. We make decisions that goes against the decision-making process of a typical human in the world. And so it sets us up really for unsafe outcomes, even dangerous outcomes in some regard. And so if we're expected to solely make decisions based on what maybe makes the most sense logically or what protects us the best, then we're going to end up actually doing things contrary to the way God set them up.
Yeah, and I guess that I would add, to a point that you're hitting on, that really our decision making is just, we're approaching it as disciples of Jesus from a totally different vantage point than the way the world would approach decisions, or at least we should be. If I'm just making all the same decisions that the people around me are making, then what does that say about my perspective and how it's really not all that different from the world's? But the perspective that we have is that ultimately we are doing what is pragmatic and practical and safe by doing things in the here and now, in the immediate kind of scope, that seem to the outsiders to be not pragmatic, practical, or safe. Great example of that, I think, is the parables Jesus told in Matthew 13 of the treasure hidden in the field, the pearl of great price. And what both of those parables have in common is that those people sold all that they had to buy what they knew was valuable. And I just I just try to put myself in the shoes of what their friends and family must have thought to see somebody do that. If I was to empty my savings account and empty every dollar that I had and sell all my stuff to buy something that nobody else recognized as valuable, then people would really start to feel sorry for me and think that I was being just foolish. But what they recognized is that what they were giving up paled in comparison to what they were actually getting. And so these principles of laying up treasures in heaven is really, I think, what should be reflected in the decisions that we make. That to the outsiders and in the short term, it is not pragmatic, practical, or safe. But really what we're doing is we're entrusting ourselves to something that is really ultimately the only thing that is safe, and to someone, I guess I should say.
Absolutely. And history and I guess tradition tells us that all of the apostles, save for maybe John, ended up dying, being killed, in fact, not just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but because of the teaching that they had taken to heart and the way that they had lived their life. And so, if we were just to look at examples, okay, what happens to people that really take on Jesus's teaching and disciple themselves to him? Well, then you end up with stories of martyrs. You don't even have to leave the book of Acts to see that happen to Stephen. And certainly we understand that that's exactly what happened to our Lord Jesus. He lived his life according to the will of God that he came to do, and it got him killed. And so certainly I'm not advocating for us making dangerous decisions just to make dangerous decisions, but our perspective is not an earthly one. It's an eternal heavenly one. And some of the things that God calls his people to be and to do operate on tables or with things in mind that are not just worldly and are not just considering, my 70 or 80-year life.
Yeah. And I think you see that reflected in Paul too. Like there were times when he would leave a place because it wasn't safe. He wasn't just going to throw himself into harm's way just for the sake of it. But he certainly never shied away from going into harm's way when that was called for. I think most notably like Acts 14, right? Like he's stoned in Lystra and, by all accounts dead. And then he gets up and he goes right back to Lystra and preaches again. And like the book of Acts is filled with these just totally reckless kind of things. But that's what it looks like, I think, when people commit themselves to God.
Yeah. And conversely, if we consider the question, I think you might actually see that someone has the wrong perspective if they are solely making decisions based on what's pragmatic or safe. Because for all the reasons we've said, that's not the most important criteria that God gives.
I want to come at this from a little bit different angle. There are difficult decisions that we make from time to time where there's no clear right or wrong choice. How should we approach that?
Yeah, so that is probably the hardest decision to make when you are looking for the right and wrong and you can't seem to find it. You see merit on kind of both sides of the decision. In fact, we moved to San Francisco about almost exactly a year ago from Atlanta, and we didn't really have any reason to leave Atlanta except just choosing to do so, choosing to take on a new work, some new challenges. And that was kind of a decision that fell in this realm for my wife and I. And we wrestled with it and wrestled with it and wrestled with it. And we would come up with ways that we thought it was the right thing to do. And then it seemed like a moment later or a day later, we'd come up with reasons that we thought it was the wrong thing to do. And I think at the end of the day, if God hasn't spoken conclusively on something being wrong for us to pursue, what we end up with are principles that can kind of guide us. Carter has actually been teaching a study through 1 Corinthians recently here in San Francisco. And one of the things that I noticed, and I think we all kind of noticed in the study going through 1 Corinthians, is in discussing some of the principles at play in that book, he has these phrases that come up a couple times. He says, like, all things are lawful, talking about it may be right, but not all things are helpful. And then he also goes on to say, like, all things are lawful, but I won't be dominated by it, by anything. And then all things are lawful, but not all things build up. And so that's been a helpful framework for me to consider questions or decisions where there doesn't seem to be a clear right and wrong from a godly perspective. I ask myself, like, okay, would this be a helpful thing? Would this be something that might dominate me? Would it be something that I could like be built up by or build up others in? And while, sometimes those principles don't always apply in every situation, I do think they offer us helpful framework to begin to kind of read between wrong and right and read into godly wisdom a bit.
Yeah. And like maybe just to sort of like distill what you're saying, it's almost like you can work through this with like a flow chart, I think, where it's like, okay, what we've been saying is if God has spoken on the issue directly, then that sort of settles it. But then if God has spoken on the issue in principle, then that can settle it also. But if neither one of those questions seem to have an obvious answer, well, then I need to start to think, I think, a little bit more introspectively and say, okay, have I prayed about it? Have I asked God for wisdom on it? Have I asked for counsel from others who maybe are wiser, who have a better perspective? Because, maybe I don't need to just write off the possibility that there is a right and a wrong choice here. And maybe somebody else is able to see that and point it out to me. And then, like, if still after all of that, though, it just doesn't seem clear, we just have to ask, okay, well, what's wise? And make that decision. But this whole conversation reminds me of what Paul says in Philippians chapter 1, where he's talking about a choice, in a sense, of living and dying. And he says in Philippians 1:22, which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. And so it's like Paul is dealing with his desire and what's better, but then what's necessary to help other people. And I think those are all the factors that have to be weighed to say, okay, what is the wise decision? And to be honest about, what do I want? What's better? How can I help others in the most effective ways? And if we pray about it, God tells us that he'll give us wisdom to make the right choices on that. So,
yeah. And something you mentioned earlier in this podcast that I think is important to think about is that the Bible is not meant to be a crystal ball.
right.
It's not going to like show you every path for your life. And in some ways, I wish it was, so I could kind of more mindlessly just kind of do what I'm told or what's expected of me and kind of go about my day. But that's not the point of being a new creation in Christ. It's that we're free, and we're free to choose how we exercise our liberties and how we exercise the principles God's instilled in us. And so really, when we don't have a right or wrong, when we've gone through the process that you were talking about, Josh, it can be a freeing thing to then kind of come to that conclusion and say, you know what? It's possible that in either decision that I make, God will be equally pleased as long as I continue to be and pursue the things that I need to be and to pursue. And so one way that I've kind of begun to phrase that just for myself is like, sometimes there's a good and a gooder, or there's just good and good. And you just kind of have to make a choice knowing that personally you're committed to the right things, and just let yourself kind of be at peace with that, knowing that God will guide you through it.
You know, you both have made a really big decision that you've already talked about with your move. Making these decisions, given us more confidence. Did you guys talk to someone in particular besides your spouse? Did you reach out to someone to help you feel more confident in making a decision?
Yeah, I mean, I went through that process that I was just kind of describing. And so step one, is there any verse that says whether or not I should move to San Francisco? And the answer was no. Unfortunately, I couldn't find that verse. And so then the next thing was like, okay, well, what principles should I look to for how to make this decision? And I prayed a lot about it, and I did look to others for counsel. And I think it was very important that I talk to people from a diverse range of ages and backgrounds, and tried to like see this decision from different perspectives. And there were people who point blank told me it would be a mistake to move and to go. And then there were people who point blank told me the exact opposite, saying like, if you don't do this, you're going to regret it. I think that just illustrates that sometimes our perspective can totally skew the way that we're seeing something one way or the other. And maybe there's elements of truth on both sides. But I think the principle that has helped me the most is things like Romans 8:28 that tell us that we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. If I'm making these decisions based on a love for God, and I am seeking him, and I'm reflecting in my choices the things that are important to him, then I can feel confident that it's going to work out for good. And God's promised that. And it doesn't mean that there may not be suffering, or there may not be sacrifice, and there may not be hard times, but ultimately it'll work out for good in some ways. And so that's I worked through that process that I described, and obviously ended up with the decision that I made. But I think that I could have made either choice and been motivated by a love for God, and God could have used either decision to work out for good.
I would just like the record to show that Josh said that it was unfortunate that a verse didn't exist to prevent him from moving here.
I said one way or the other.
I would echo everything Josh said. I had mixed responses as well. and I don't intend to speak negatively of anybody, but when I surveyed the smattering of responses that I got on this the spectrum of from positive to negative, oftentimes at first glance, because I was talking to people that had some level of faith, there would be some measure of spiritualness, if I can use that word, in their response to my question about moving out here. But oftentimes, once I started really digging into what they said and thinking hard and praying about it, I would find kind of the core of what was motivating, what was spiritual about what they were saying. And sometimes it was what seemed to be courage. They said, oh, you can do this. Like, this is going to be a great thing. Whatever version that they encouraged me with, it seemed to be like a faithfulness and a courage and whatever. And then sometimes, like on the other side of things, if they were discouraging and it was for spiritual reasons, they would say, well, consider your faith. Like, you don't want to shipwreck your own faith. You don't want to lose your soul trying to go to this place, or like, you don't want to hurt your family or whatever. And those are very real concerns. And I would say even biblical ones. But maybe sometimes, and where I kind of landed on this, is we need to make decisions that are not necessarily wrong or right, but that are going to push us to grow. And what I kind of settled on was, those are valid concerns, but if I grow, they aren't concerns anymore. And so I wanted to make choices that would push me to be stronger, not stay where I was. And so sometimes that can be a principle when there's not a wrong or right thing that gives us, in fact, that actually does give us courage or confidence to make a decision to say like, hey, actually, I'm not sure what the right decision is, but I know that if I choose this thing, I'm going to be forced to grow. And that was kind of my motivation with that one particular decision.
And isn't that really like the whole upside down, backwards way of thinking that the kingdom presents to us? Is you lose your life to find it, right? That like you are faithful over a few things and you are set over much, is what Jesus would say. And then we would enter into the joy of our master. And so I think that like when we learn to live by faith in these decisions, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, that we learn the joy of dedicating ourselves to God. And it may require some sacrifice and some suffering and some discomfort, but ultimately that's the only way that real joy and satisfaction comes. We lose our life to find it.
So for our listeners, we may not be forced with a move, but we are forced with some difficult decisions. And some of the things that I jotted down for me personally from the conversation and listening to you guys is that when I'm in the midst of a difficult decision in the future, the love for God needs to be driving my decision. My prayer life needs to be there. I need to be reaching out to people. I also need to be thinking about, Josh Lewis said at the very end, is that what's going to make me grow. So with all that, guys, I just want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate both of you.
Thanks for having us. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the show. Please review, share, comment, rate,